Beckett Hayes had sent away for a quiet, biddable wife to keep his house and mend his shirts, and the woman who swung down off the train at Larkin Station, wearing a man's trail coat and a gun belt, was, he could see at a glance, going to be none of those things. She landed on the platform light as a cat, took one unimpressed look around the little Kansas cow town, and hitched her carpet bag over her shoulder before the porter could reach for it. And when Beckett stepped forward and introduced himself as the man she'd come to marry, she looked him up and down, the way a horse trader sizes up a green colt, and did not appear especially pleased with what she found. This was not the demure creature of the letters he'd been picturing for 4 months, and his face must have shown it. Her name was Callie Reardon, and she was 25, brown as saddle leather from a life outdoors, with a level stare and a way of standing with her weight balanced, like she was ready to move fast if she had to. She had grown up on a hard-scrabble Texas ranch as the only child of a cattleman who'd wanted a son and raised the daughter he got exactly like one, and she could rope and ride and shoot and read cattle better than most grown men, and she had never in her life kept a quiet house or mended a shirt with any goodwill about it. When the Texas ranch was lost to drought and debt, and her father died in the losing of it, Callie had answered a Kansas rancher's advertisement because a woman alone with cattle skills and no cattle had few enough roads open to her, and marriage was the one that kept a roof overhead. She had been honest in her letters about what she was, more or less, but Beckett Hayes had read what he wanted to read, the way lonely men do, and skated right past the parts where she mentioned breaking horses and standing night watch. Now here she was in the flesh, gun belt and all, and here he was, a proud particular man who liked his household orderly and his women soft, and the two of them stood on that platform taking each other's measure, and each privately concluding they'd made a serious mistake. Beckett reached again for her bag out of manners, and Callie shifted it out of his reach without a word, and hauled it into the wagon herself. What neither of them could have known, standing there prickly and disappointed in the Kansas wind, was that within the month Callie Reardon was going to save Beckett Hayes's entire ranch, and very likely his life, in the middle of the worst night either of them would ever see, and that the sparks flying between them on that platform were the first sign of a fire that would burn the rest of their lives. But to get to that night, they first had to spend a month driving each other half to distraction, because two strong people who fit together perfectly almost never see it at the start. Beckett Hayes was 32, and he ran a good-sized cattle spread on the open prairie outside Larkin, and he was, by his own honest reckoning, a man who liked things a certain way. He had built the ranch up careful and particular over 10 years, and he ran it the same, everything in its place, every job done proper, and he had wanted a wife who would bring that same tidy order into his house, which was the one part of his life that had gone to seed living alone. He was not a bad man, not cruel or small, but he was set in his ways and quietly certain that a man ran the ranch and a woman ran the house, and that the two did not overlap, because that was how it had been in his father's house and every house he knew. So Callie Reardon was, from his first sight of her, a problem he did not know how to file. She showed no interest whatsoever in the house. She left her mending in a heap and burned the first supper she tried, and did not seem the least bit ashamed of either, and instead she spent her days out at the corrals and on the range, where a wife had no business being, offering opinions on his stock and his grass and his methods that were, most maddeningly of all, usually right. Within a week, she had told his foreman he was worming the horses wrong, told Beckett himself that he was overgrazing the east section, and roped and thrown a sick yearling for doctoring faster than any two of his hands could have managed it, all while Beckett stood there feeling the ground of his orderly world tilt under him. He did not know what to do with her, and so he did what proud particular men do when their certainties are threatened, which was to get stiff and cold and stand on his authority. He told her, more than once, that ranch work was not a woman's place, and that he'd thank her to tend the house she'd been sent for. Every time he said it, Callie would fix him with that level, unimpressed stare, and remind him that the house he was so proud of had been kept by a bachelor eating out of cans for 10 years, and that she could rope a steer or bake a pie, but not both, while he was busy telling her which one was womanly, and then she'd go right back out to the corrals. They struck sparks off each other from morning to night, and Beckett told himself, lying awake, that he had made a terrible mistake, and could not for the life of him figure out why he kept finding reasons to be wherever she was working. For her part, Callie Reardon had not come to Kansas looking for love, and she was not about to change herself into somebody's tidy parlor wife for a stiff-necked man who thought a woman's worth ended at the kitchen door. She had spent her whole life being told, by a father who loved her and a world that didn't, that the things she was best at were not fit for a girl, and she had made a hard peace with being herself anyway, and she was not going to unmake it now for Beckett Hayes and his opinions about womanly places. She'd take the roof and the marriage because she needed them, but she would not be made small to earn them, and if that meant a month of butting heads with a proud man, then she'd butt heads. But she was fair-minded under the flint, and she could see, even through her irritation, that Beckett Hayes was not the tyrant his stiff talk made him sound. She watched how he ran his outfit, and it was a good outfit, honestly run, his hands well treated and his stock well cared for, and she saw that his fussy particular ways came not from meanness, but from a man who had built everything he had out of nothing and was afraid, underneath, of it all slipping away. She recognized the fear, because she'd watched her own father's ranch slip away, and it softened her toward him against her will. She started, without quite meaning to do things his careful way where it made sense, and to explain herself where it didn't, and the sparring between them changed slowly from pure friction into something with a current running under it. The current caught them both off guard. There was an evening when Callie broke a Mustang that 3 of Beckett's hands had given up on, staying on its back through a bucking fury that had the whole outfit lining the corral rails, and when she finally stepped down, breathing hard and grinning wild, she found Beckett staring at her with an expression that was not disapproval at all. He caught himself and scowled and said something stiff about her being reckless, but the scowl came too late, and Callie had seen what was under it, and she rode a strange warm feeling all the way to sleep that night, and was annoyed with herself for it. 2 proud people who each expected to dislike the other were discovering, to their mutual irritation, that dislike was not the word for it, and neither of them had the first idea what to do about that. The thing that finally cracked the standoff open was trouble, the way trouble often is the thing that shows people what they are to each other. Beckett's outfit had been losing cattle off the east line, a few head at a time, and everyone knew it was rustlers working the edges of the big open range, but the losses had been small enough to bear and hard enough to catch that Beckett had let it ride. Callie could not let it ride. She had grown up watching rustlers bleed her father's ranch dry a few head at a time until there was nothing left, and she knew exactly how that story ended, and she was not going to sit in the house and mend shirts while it happened again. So she started riding the east line herself, against Beckett's express and repeated instruction, tracking the thieves' pattern, with an eye trained by a lifetime of it. And one gray dawn, she came galloping back into the yard, having found their crossing point, and read their whole operation off the ground like a page of print. She laid it out for Beckett in the yard, sharp and certain, where they were cutting the fence, and when and how many, and how he could catch them if he'd set a watch on the right night at the right gap. Beckett's first reaction was to be furious that she'd been out there alone, and he said so, hot, and for a moment the old fight flared up between them worse than ever. But then he actually listened to what she'd found, and he was too good a cattleman not to see that she was right, dead right, that she'd solved in a week the problem he'd been losing cattle over for a month. Something shifted in Beckett Hayes then, standing in that dawn yard, a proud man forced to see plain that the woman he'd been trying to shove into the house was better at the heart of his own work than he was. He set the watch where she said, on the night she said, and they caught the rustlers cold, and afterward, riding home in the dark with the thieves handed to the county, Beckett was quiet a long while before he said the thing that cost his pride so much. He told her she'd been right, and that he'd been a fool to try to make her into something she wasn't, and that he'd not do it again. Callie, riding beside him in the dark, felt the last of her flint go soft, and told him, gruff, that she'd try to burn fewer suppers, and it was as close to a love song as either of them could manage yet. They were still figuring out the new, easier ground between them, still shy and prickly, but no longer at war, when the real test came. And it came the way the worst things on the prairie always came, out of a clear evening sky, with almost no warning. It was high summer, and Beckett had his whole herd, the entire wealth and future of the ranch, gathered on the near range for a count, before the drive to the railhead. Hundreds of head bunched close, when the storm rolled up out of the southwest, faster than any storm had a right to. The air went green and still and heavy, and the cattle grew restless the way cattle do when they smell it coming, and Beckett and Callie both looked at that sky, and then at each other, and knew, without a word, exactly what was about to happen. Thunder came like the end of the world, a crack directly overhead that shook the ground, and the whole herd went up at once and broke into a dead run in the blind terror of a full stampede. Hundreds of tons of panicked cattle poured across the dark prairie in a thundering flood, and they were headed, Callie saw at once, straight for the cutbank along the creek, a drop that would pile the whole herd into a dying, broken heap at the bottom, and finish Beckett Hayes for good. 10 years of work gone in 5 minutes of terror. The hands were scattered, and half of them cut off by the running herd, and Beckett was shouting orders that no one could hear over the thunder and the drumming hooves. And for one frozen moment, the disaster was simply happening, unstoppable, in the lightning-lit dark. Callie Reardon did not freeze. She had ridden point on Stampede since she was 15, and her body knew what to do before her mind caught up, and she put her heels to her horse and shot out into the dark at a flat, reckless gallop to do the one thing that could save the herd, which was to reach the lead steers and turn them. It was the most dangerous work there was, riding hard alongside a running wall of maddened cattle in the black and the rain, one stumble meaning death under 1,000 hooves, and she did it without a second's hesitation, because Beckett Hayes's whole life was pouring toward that cutbank, and she was the only one fast enough and skilled enough to head it. I have heard old cattlemen describe turning a stampede, and every one of them speaks of it the way a man speaks of the bravest thing he ever saw, and what Callie Reardon did on that black Kansas prairie was the bravest thing Beckett Hayes ever saw in his life. She drove her horse up the flank of the running herd in the dark, pressing closer and closer to the terrified leaders, using her voice and her body, and every hard-won trick of a lifetime, to bend the front of that living flood a few degrees, and then a few more, working them by inches away from the cutbank and into a wide, slow turn. Lightning showed her to Beckett in flashes, a small figure riding hell for leather alongside death, and his heart was in his throat, because one wrong step of her horse in a prairie dog hole meant she'd vanish under the herd and never be seen whole again. She got them turning. Slowly, impossibly, the head of the stampede began to curve, and where a straight run had meant the cutbank in ruin, the turn began to bend the whole herd into itself, into the great circling mill that is the only thing that stops a stampede, hundreds of head wheeling into a vast spinning wheel of horn and muscle until the panic had nowhere left to run and spent itself against its own turning. Callie rode that circle until the cattle slowed and milled and finally stood, blowing and trembling but alive, the whole herd saved, 10 yards from the killing drop. She had turned the wealth of the ranch away from destruction with nothing but nerve and a good horse and everything her father had ever taught the daughter he'd raised like a son. Beckett reached her as the rain came down in earnest, and he swung off his horse and pulled her down off hers and into his arms before either of them knew he'd done it, and he was shaking harder than she was. He held her in the pouring rain among the milling cattle, and all his careful, proud reserve was simply gone, washed clean off him by the terror of nearly watching her die, and he said her name over and over like he was checking she was real. When he finally got words together, they came out raw and unguarded, that he'd thought he'd lost her, that watching her ride out into that had shown him in one lightning-lit second exactly what she was to him, and that he'd been the biggest fool in Kansas, wasting a month pretending otherwise. They rode home slow through the clearing storm, soaked to the skin and too wrung out for pride, and Beckett Hayes finally said the whole of what the Stampede had knocked loose in him. He told her, plainly, no stiffness left, that he had sent away for a quiet, biddable wife because he'd thought that was what he wanted, and that God had sent him Callie Reardon instead, and that God had known a great deal better than he had. He told her he'd spent a month trying to shrink her down into the small, tidy thing he'd imagined, and that he was ashamed of it now, because the woman he'd been trying to shrink had just done a thing not one man on his outfit could have done and saved everything he owned in the doing. "I don't want a quiet wife who keeps out of my work," Beckett said, and the rain had stopped, and the stars were coming out, and he had eyes only for her. "I've had a month of watching you be twice the cattleman I am, and it galled my pride at first. I won't lie about it, and then somewhere it stopped galling and started being the best thing I ever saw. I want a partner, Callie. I want the woman who turned that herd tonight riding beside me for the rest of my life, running this ranch as my equal in every acre of it. I was a fool about the house and the mending and all of it. Burn every supper you like. Just don't ever let me lose you off the front of a Stampede again, because I found out tonight I couldn't stand it." Callie Reardon, who had braced her whole life against being told to be less than she was, sat her horse in the starlight and heard a proud man ask her to be exactly what she was and more, and it undid her more thoroughly than any soft words could have. She told him, rough because tenderness came hard to her, that she'd spent the month sure she'd made a mistake coming, sure he'd never see past her gun belt to the woman wearing it, and that she'd been fighting him partly because it was easier than admitting she'd started to care what he thought. She told him she loved him, which cost her something to say, and then she told him that if he ever again suggested she take up mending as a womanly duty, she'd rope him and leave him in the corral, and Beckett laughed out loud in the wet starlight and pulled her half out of her saddle to kiss her. There was one more knot to work through, because the neighbor whose land ran alongside Beckett's, a rich cattleman named Ansel Fry, had been circling the Hayes ranch for a year, wanting to buy Beckett out and roll the spread into his own growing empire. Fry had heard about the Stampede and the Rustlers, and being the kind of man who reads other people's troubles as opportunities, he came calling with an offer to buy the ranch at a low price, all sympathy on the surface and pure appetite underneath, certain that a man who'd nearly lost his whole herd would be ready to sell cheap and get out. He had not counted on Callie. It was Callie who sat across the table from Ansel Fry and did the arithmetic that Beckett, too proud and too tired, might have gotten wrong. She had spent the month learning every inch and every ledger of the Hayes place, and she knew to the dollar what it was worth and what it could be worth, and she saw Fry's lowball offer for exactly the Vulture's bargain it was. She laid it out cold and clear, the value of the grass and the water and the improved herd, the coming rise in beef prices that any man reading the eastern markets could see, the plain fact that the ranch was not in trouble at all, but on the edge of its best years, and she watched Ansel Fry's smooth confidence curdle as he understood that Beckett Hayes had acquired, along with a wife, a business partner sharper than any Fry had ever crossed. Fry left empty-handed and irritated, and Beckett watched his wife dismantle a rich man's scheme across his own kitchen table and felt a pride so large it near choked him. He told her so, and she shrugged it off, but he could see she was pleased to have her worth put to use and valued. And he made her a promise then that he kept the rest of his life. He told her that from that day the ranch was as much hers as his, her name on the deed and her voice in every decision, and that he'd been a fool ever to think a marriage was a man running one half of a life and a woman the other, when the whole thing ran so much better shared. Callie held him to it, and he was glad of it, every year they had. They were married properly that autumn, though in truth they'd been married in every way that counted since the night of the Stampede, and the wedding was a plain, quick affair because neither of them had patience for fuss. Callie did not wear a fine gown, and she'd have laughed at anyone who suggested it, and Beckett would not have wanted her to, because he had fallen in love with the woman in the trail coat and the gun belt, and had no wish to marry anyone tidier. They stood up in the little church at Larkin, two brown-weathered independent people who had each expected to spend their lives alone rather than bend, and had found instead someone worth bending toward, and the whole Cowtown congregation could see plain that this was a true match and not an arranged one. The marriage was, by every account, a stormy and a happy one, the way a marriage of two strong-willed people is bound to be. They fought, because neither was built to be quiet when they thought the other wrong, and their arguments were legendary around Larkin, two experts going at each other over grass and cattle and the running of the place with a heat that alarmed strangers and amused their friends. But the fighting was the fighting of equals who respected each other, never the grinding down of one by the other, and every storm cleared as fast as a prairie squall and left the ground greener, and underneath every argument ran a current of pure, fierce love that the whole county could see. Beckett Hayes had wanted an orderly, quiet life, and instead he got Callie Reardon, and he used to say, grinning, that it was the loudest and least orderly and best thing that ever happened to him. There is a line from Louisa May Alcott that Callie Reardon might have written herself. "I am not afraid of storms," Alcott wrote, "for I am learning how to sail my ship." Callie had never been afraid of storms, real or otherwise, had ridden into the literal worst one Kansas could throw at her, and turned it, and she was not about to be afraid of the storms of a marriage to a strong-willed man either. She sailed her ship straight into the weather her whole life, and she taught Beckett to sail beside her, instead of trying to calm the seas, and the two of them made better time through life together, storms and all, than either would have made alone in fair weather. I will tell you how it went, because you have come the whole way and earned it. Beckett and Callie Hayes ran that Kansas ranch together for 40 years and built it into one of the great cattle operations of the region, not despite their both being strong and stubborn, but because of it. Two sharp cattle minds pushing each other to do better season after season. Callie became something of a legend in that part of the country, the cowgirl who'd turned a stampede on a black night and saved a ranch, and young women for 100 miles grew up on the story, and more than one of them decided, because of it, that they need not be small and quiet to be worth a good man's love. They had children, and Callie raised her daughters exactly as her father had raised her, in the saddle and the corral, teaching them to rope and ride and read cattle and stand their own ground, and she raised her sons to know that the best woman a man could find was one who'd ride beside him and not behind him. Beckett, who had once been so sure a woman's place was the house, lived to see his own daughters run cattle better than most men, and he was prouder of it than of anything he owned, and he'd tell the story of the stampede to his grandchildren, with tears standing in his eyes, at the part where the lightning showed him what he'd nearly lost. When Callie Hayes was an old woman, gray but still straight in the saddle, a young reporter came out to write up the famous cowgirl of the Larkin country and asked her whether it was true her husband had sent for a helpless bride and gotten her instead. Callie laughed at that, a big, unladylike laugh. "He ordered a quiet little wife to mend his shirts," she said, "and the good Lord, who has a sense of humor, sent him me. He spent a month trying to shrink me to fit his idea, and I spent a month refusing, and then a storm came, and I turned his whole herd off a cut bank, and after that, he never once asked me to be less again. That's the only marriage worth having, young man. Find the person who wants you at your full size, storms and gun belt and all, and never you settle for one who wants you smaller. I'd have burned every supper in Kansas before I'd have shrunk myself, and I married the one man wise enough to be glad of it." Here is what stays with me about the two of them. Beckett Hayes went looking for a small, quiet, convenient thing, because that is what the world had taught him a wife should be, and he very nearly missed the great love and the great partner of his life, because she came in a package he hadn't ordered. It took a stampede on a black night, took her nearly dying in front of him, to knock the wrong idea out of his head and let him see the extraordinary woman he'd been trying to make ordinary. We do that, all of us. We go looking for what we've been told to want, and nearly walk right past what would actually save us. If someone comes into your life at their full, stubborn, glorious size, and it frightens you, look again before you try to shrink them. You might be looking at the one who'll turn the herd when everything you have is running for the cliff. If this one warmed you, stay a while by the fire. There are more of them coming, more women who refuse to be made small, and found the ones wise enough to love them large, and every last one is worth the time it takes to tell.